What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. We have Vergil Ortiz Jr., 18 wins and 0 losses, taking on Michael McKinson, 21 wins and 0 losses. Now, although these are two undefeated fighters, their reputations and stature in the game is not the same. Vergil Ortiz Jr. has emerged to be one of the most exciting young prospects turned top contenders in boxing over the past few years. Whereas Michael McKinson is, largely unknown to the greater, boxing public. He's pretty much been a regional talent out of the UK at this point, still very young. He's only 27 years old. But in the context of Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Michael McKinson, McKinson is clearly the B-side. Basically, he is the feed me now until I get a bigger opponent later opponent for Vergil Ortiz Jr. Now, the thing about that is, even some of these highly favored A-sides versus B-sides, who on the surface are clearly outmatched on paper, lately there have been some mega upsets in multiple divisions on all levels of elite versus either near elite or totally non-elite. A lot of these B-sides have really overperformed against the fighter who's supposed to basically just show up and take care of business. I mean, we saw Sander Martin upset Mikey Garcia, George Kambosos upset Teofimo Lopez, and most recently, we saw Jack Catterall get denied a decision win that most people thought he deserved against the undisputed champion at 140, Josh Taylor. So Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Michael McKinson, supposed to be essentially a stay busy fight for Vergil Ortiz Jr., even though Michael McKinson, as I said, is currently undefeated. Now, I had first seen Vergil Ortiz Jr. on the two undercards of Triple G versus Saul Canelo Alvarez, or I think it was even billed at the time, Canelo versus Triple G, even though Canelo was still the relative newcomer to the middleweight division when he fought Golovkin. But Vergil Ortiz Jr. was fighting on both of these undercards, and he was just annihilating his opponents. Like, to this day, Vergil Ortiz Jr. has still knocked out every one of his opponents. He's 18-0 with 18 stoppages. And although I had seen him in these two Triple G versus, Canelo undercards, the fight that really caught my attention was when he fought against Mauricio Herrera, the guy who many believe should have gotten a decision win over Danny Garcia, still prime Danny Garcia. And Vergil Ortiz Jr. fought an aging Mauricio Herrera, who's kind of like a slick, difficult, crafty, sweet scientist style fighter. And Vergil Ortiz Jr. just obliterated Mauricio Herrera, knocked him out in the 3rd round. I've seen Mauricio Herrera lose before. I've never seen anybody do that to him. And so I was thinking at that point, take notice. What's that guy's name? Something Ortiz. It's not Victor Ortiz. We remember Victor Ortiz. This is Vergil Ortiz Jr. Remember that name. And since then, he has basically taken on, one journeyman or former contender, former prospect. He knocked out Antonio Orozco in the 6th round. Brad Solomon, who was once a highly touted prospect himself, knocked him out in the 5th round. Just destroyed Samuel Vargas. It took him 7 rounds to get rid of Samuel Vargas, beat him, and then he had his 2 biggest step-up fights. The first was against Maurice Hooker, who was a former belt holder at 140 until he lost his title against the also Robert Garcia-trained Jose Ramirez. It was a battle, not undisputed, but it was one belt holder against another, so it was a title unification fight at 140 between Ramirez and Hooker, and Ramirez stopped Hooker, I believe, in the 5th round of that fight. Maurice Hooker, a couple fights later, fights Vergil Ortiz Jr. up at 147. First few rounds are super interesting, but then Vergil Ortiz Jr. just really laid into Maurice Hooker. And, Vergil Ortiz got rocked a couple times in that fight, and then he kind of started to take over with the jab. As devastating as some of Vergil Ortiz Jr.'s power punches are, especially like when he starts going to the body, just nasty, devastating blows. That's one of the first things that captivated me when I saw him versus Herrera a few fights back, was how he throws these blistering shots to the body. And as laser-like as those body punches and power punches are for Vergil Ortiz Jr., I actually think that his best punch might be his jab. Like, he's got a jab that is a hard jab. It's not just a keep you off. It's not just like a blind you or just kind of get you to reset type of jab. No, it's kind of like a sharp missile of just a pummeling, not a battering ram type of jab, but still just a missile, a quick laser-like jab. And that started to take over in the middle rounds against Hooker. And Hooker, I still don't think that his body is built to code to handle the onslaughts at 147. We'll see how his career plays out. He did suffer a shoulder or hand injury towards the end of the fight against Vergil Ortiz Jr., which was ultimately what stopped the fight. But watching the fight, you got the feeling that the writing was on the wall and that Maurice Hooker was on his way out against Vergil Ortiz Jr. So that was a 7th round TKO. By the way, I had mentioned that Vergil Ortiz Jr., like Jose Ramirez, trained by the famed Robert Garcia. Well, after Vergil Ortiz's last fight against Idris Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, Vergil Ortiz and company, his company being his dad, basically his lifelong trainer, his dad, and I believe the other main lifelong-ish trainer is Hector Beltran. But those have been the guys, basically Vergil Ortiz's day ones. He then, in his professional career, linked with Robert Garcia, who's just, managed and trained all kinds of great fighters throughout the years. Probably the most famed, I would say maybe the most famed Mexican trainer in the modern era. I mean, there's Abel Sanchez, there's Joel Diaz, there are several others, but Robert Garcia and what he's represented to Mexican boxing and Mexican-American boxing over the years. I mean, he's trained a lot of non-Mexican fighters, but out of Southern California, that has just kind of been his bread and butter, and he's been one of the best to do it over the past, 15 to 20 years. Well, Vergil Ortiz Jr., after this last fight with Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, which was supposed to be another step-up fight, Mean Machine famously, should have been given a knockdown over Terrence Crawford, hurt Crawford early in their fight, got stopped by Crawford later in the fight. This was a couple months before the COVID pandemic started, so this is November 2019. Well, Vergil Ortiz fought Mean Machine in August of 2021. Again, that's his most recent fight, and Vergil Ortiz got hurt a couple times pretty badly. One of them I thought should have been called the knockdown. He got hit, then he threw a punch and fell down. I think there were 2 different instances where the ref ruled it a slip, where it could have very easily been called a knockdown for Mean Machine. Well, Vergil Ortiz, again, his jab kind of took over the fight, started to really put it on Mean Machine, mixing up the attack from the head to the body. He throws in a lot of nice feints. He's got nice height for the 147-pound division. He's about 5'10", maybe 5'11", listed at 5'10". But recently I saw him, sparring the 5'8"-ish Brian Castano, who's about to fight a rematch with Jermell Charlo for the undisputed all 4 belts at 154. Well, I recently saw a picture of Vergil Ortiz Jr. standing next to Brian Castano after they sparred, and he looked like he was at least about 3 inches taller than Castano. But yeah, he's got good height for the division, just nasty punching power, good boxing IQ, and his chin was really tested in his last couple fights. First against, again, Maurice Hooker, and then against Mean Machine, where it was damn, is this about to be an upset for Mean Machine over Vergil Ortiz Jr.? Well, again, he started to take over in the middle rounds. He ended up finishing Mean Machine in the 8th round, which again continues his knockout streak. And then after that fight with Mean Machine, him, his dad, and Hector Beltran leave Robert Garcia, and a lot of people start immediately speculating, and the word was out that, oh, Vergil Ortiz is leaving Robert Garcia to join forces with Canelo's trainer, Eddie Reynoso. Well, no. Vergil Ortiz actually ended up going with Manny Robles. That was Andy Ruiz Jr.'s former trainer. So again, Vergil Ortiz Sr. is still in Vergil Ortiz Jr.'s corner, but the next trainer that they're going to for assistance appears to be Manny Robles. So after that super exciting performance against Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, Vergil Ortiz Jr.'s next opponent is Michael McKinson, who, again, 21-0, but only 2 of his wins have come via knockout. Now, we've seen some fighters who don't have the greatest knockout ability. A lot of really good fighters haven't scored a ton of knockouts. Paulie Malignaggi is one of the first that come to mind, but 2 out of 21, damn. Usually a fighter, when they're turning pro, they're going to stack up a lot of knockouts and TKOs just on the strength of how good and skilled that they are. And whether or not they have a ton of punching power, if you are working your way up to the elite level, you're going to get your knockouts usually in that first half of your career, and then you start winning more and more fights via decision because your opponents are just getting better and better more consistently. But damn, it's not every day you see somebody who's fighting an elite fighter with only like a 10%, around 10% knockout ratio. Very rare. But, you know, Michael McKinson, one thing I will say that makes this matchup kind of interesting is the fact that he is going to be the first southpaw that Vergil Ortiz Jr. has fought in like his last 8 or 9 fights. The last time Vergil Ortiz fought a southpaw was against Jesus Valdez-Bataillon. That was way back in 2019. Now I say way back in 2019 like it wasn't just like 2 to 3 years ago, but it was like 8 fights ago for Vergil Ortiz Jr. because he was very busy in 2019 and has had, well, to be specific, he's had 6 fights since that fight against Bataillon. But yeah, he doesn't fight a lot of southpaws, so I think that that's going to be kind of interesting. And if you see McKinson's style of fighting, he's definitely a back foot style fighter where he's elusive. He's pretty slick defensively, like in a lot of his fights against, you know, Chris Congo, Luis Vedon. Like, he might not be scoring the knockout, but he's scoring knockdowns in some of these fights, and he's very difficult to hit for these opponents, especially in the early rounds. So McKinson he gets off to an early lead with the first few rounds by controlling the fight with his distance control. And he's usually setting up a lot of nice straight left hands. He mixes up the jab. He'll go jab high and low, but he'll also just do a lot of feints. So both he and Vergil Ortiz do a lot of feinting to get the shot off and then kind of reestablish range control. That's kind of Michael McKinson's game. He'll start to get a little bit more aggressive as the fight goes on, but his version of aggression is maybe throwing a combination here and there. He's not the type to put the foot on the gas and insist on getting the finish. Now, Michael McKinson hasn't been fighting elite opponents either. This is by far going to be the best fighter that he's fought against. So, you know, this fight isn't too dissimilar, in my opinion, from when just a few weeks ago when Jaime Munguia fought Demetrius Ballard, where you look at the matchup, you're like, what the hell is Ballard doing in the ring with Jaime Munguia? And when I first heard that this fight was announced, I'm like, what the hell is Vergil Ortiz Jr. doing fighting Michael McKinson? You know, it's a little bit frustrating because in boxing, we rarely get the fights that we want. And I'm not criticizing Ortiz's fight-by-fight schedule. He's still only 23 years old. So they're actually bringing him up relatively to a lot of other hot prospects. The fact that he's already fought Mean Machine and Maurice Hooker, and then he fought some, you know, established vets, journeymen, gatekeepers like Samuel Vargas and Antonio Orozco. You know, it's like you can't get too mad at that schedule at this point. But you would hope that going forward for his next few fights, he's going to be fighting more elite fighters. Michael McKinson hasn't proven to be that. But I do think that the first few rounds are going to be a little bit frustrating for Vergil Ortiz Jr. Like, he's used to fighting guys who are coming at you, like Maurice Hooker. I mean, Maurice Hooker likes to establish range too, but he will throw a lot of hard combinations. Samuel Vargas, Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, Antonio Orozco. These aren't guys that are difficult to find in the ring. Michael McKinson is going to make Vergil Ortiz work to start to find him and pin him up against the ropes so he can start lacing him with some of his body shots. Now, the thing about Ortiz is, unlike a lot of other pressure fighters, Ortiz doesn't need to get you pinned up against the ropes to really start laying hands on you. A lot of guys need to get the slicker fighter, the slick boxer, kind of pinned so then they can let their hands go. No, again, Vergil Ortiz will find you right in the middle of the ring and he will hit you hard with the jab. So he's a sweet scientist himself. It just so happens he packs a knockout punch, and that's why he's got this 18-0 record with 18 knockouts. So what I expect between Ortiz and McKinson, again, I expect McKinson to kind of give him a little riddle, a puzzle to solve early. I think that Ortiz is going to establish a jab. Well, he's going to have trouble with the jab at first because the left hand is going to be ready to go and to counter the jab. So I actually think that we're going to get more right hand leads potentially from Vergil Ortiz Jr. And I think that if he's going to be doing a lot of feinting and then trying to kind of cut the ring off to force McKinson to get into boxing range, because McKinson's going to want to only exchange under his conditions. He's going to want to set the terms of engagement. Vergil Ortiz is first, I believe, going to try to take that away from him with the jab. And if he gets frustrated trying to find him with the jab, I think he's going to start going to the body early and often, to where the motion of McKinson and the mobility is going to slow down by the 4th and 5th round, to where he's going to be easier to find. And then I think that's where we'll start seeing Vergil Ortiz punish Michael McKinson high and low. But that body attack at a certain point I think is going to be relentless. I don't think that Michael McKinson is going to make it the 12-round distance. This is actually McKinson's first fight that's scheduled for 12 rounds. He's been fighting 10-rounders for like his last several fights. So this 12-round situation is new territory for McKinson. I don't think he's going to make it the 12-round distance. In fact, I have serious doubts on whether he's going to make it a full 10 rounds. Again, we've been getting a lot of upsets lately, and even in fights that don't end up resulting in the upset, we've been getting a lot of underdogs overachieving. I think that he's going to make things look like they're about to be interesting because he's going to be elusive, and he's probably going to hit Vergil Ortiz Jr. flush with a few left hands. I think Vergil Ortiz Jr. is going to figure it out slowly but surely. Now, how slowly? I don't know. It might be quicker than we expect. Now, in that Jaime Munguia versus Demetrius Ballard fight, and I'm not comparing Vergil Ortiz Jr. to Jaime Munguia, very different style of fighters, but I'm just talking in terms of mega A-side versus very lesser known B-side. Demetrius Ballard in the first round looked like, oh, is this about to be interesting? And then the second and third round happened. It's like, nope. Well, we might get that with Vergil Ortiz Jr. against McKinson, but I think it's more likely that we get a few more rounds. I think Vergil Ortiz Jr. is going to stop him in about the same range that he's been stopping all of his opponents. You know, after he stopped Herrera in the 3rd round, which was right after that Badian fight where he fought the southpaw, all of his other stoppages have been occurring between the 5th and the 8th rounds. And I think that that's the same sweet spot that he's going to get the stoppage over Michael McKinson. The question is, what do you do with Vergil Ortiz Jr., assuming he takes care of business against McKinson? Because he is in one of the best divisions in the sport. 147, it's got Errol Spence, Terrence Crawford. We don't know where Terrence Crawford's going just yet, if he's going to stay with Top Rank or go with PBC. We know Errol Spence is about to fight Yordenis Ugas. Ugas fresh off that Manny Pacquiao win. So they're going to be battling for 3 of the 4 major belts in the division. And then you've got that whole, PBC tournament going where you've got Stanionis. He's about to take on Butayev, who just beat Jamal James. You've got the hot prospect, just about as hot as Vergil Ortiz Jr. in Jaron Boots Ennis. Very scintillating division. And of course, you've got Keith Thurman and you've got Kell Brook fresh off his destruction of Amir Khan in that fight. So, and then you've got Conor Benn. Now, Conor Benn, being that Vergil Ortiz Jr., the question I was setting up was, what the hell do you do with Vergil Ortiz Jr.? He's promoted by Golden Boy, fights on DAZN. They don't really have the lion's share of the talent in this division. PBC's got almost all of the major guys. They've got Boots, they've got Errol Spence, they've got Ugas, they've got Keith Thurman, Danny Garcia, Stanionis, Butayev. They've got all the major guys, except for Terrence Crawford, Conor Benn, and Vergil Ortiz Jr. Is Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Conor Benn the eventual fight that's going to have to happen on DAZN because they don't have any of these other guys? I just really wonder what the outlook is going forward for Vergil Ortiz Jr., assuming that he stays at 147 for long enough to challenge an Errol Spence for his titles, if he's still holding the belts at the time. I just think that this is one of those situations where they're going to have to get pretty creative with the matchmaking for Vergil Ortiz Jr. But yeah, let me know what you think about this Ortiz versus McKinson fight, and what do you think they should do with Vergil Ortiz Jr. going forward? Let me know in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.